This is Ira Nirenberg again, and this is my next video. My first video was on dividing two negative numbers, and this video will be on multiplying two negative numbers. Now, there really isn't a whole lot of difference between dividing two negative numbers and multiplying two negative numbers. It's simply a question of how do we stay consistent with what we're talking about. Again, remember, consistency in mathematics means being able to make a statement and not contradict yourself. So if you're making a statement like 2 plus 3 equals 5, you better be able to make the statement 3 plus 2 equals 5. It seems logical and rational. It's because it's a true statement. So let's go back to the idea of division for a minute. Let's say we had -2 divided by -3. Well, we know from what we've done before, that answer comes out to positive 2/3. We were able to understand that because any number divided by itself had to be 1, positive 1. So we rewrote -2 as 2 times -1, and we rewrote -3 as 3 times -1. And so we had a positive 2 over a positive 3 and a -1 over a -1. -1 over -1 ended up being 1. We were left with 2/3. Okay, let's take that -2 over -3 and let's rewrite it using the definition of multiplication. Because -2/3, or let's stick to 2/3 for a moment, 2/3 is what? It's saying you've got 2 1/3. Well, if I had 2 5s, I could write that as 2 times 5 using the definition of multiplication. So if I have 2 1/3, I could just as easily write it as 2 times 1/3. Okay, well now if I have -2 over -3, I could write that as -2 times -1/3. If you like, think of the 1 in the numerator of 1/3 as a positive quantity, and the -3 and the 3 in the bottom as being negative. In any case, and you'll see this written up afterwards, you have -2 times a -1/3. Okay, but gee whiz, we already know the answer is the same as -2 over -3, and we know that is positive from our first video when we divided two numbers. So -2 times -1/3, since it's the same as -2 over -3, and we know -2 over -3 is positive, well, that tells us that when we multiply a negative number times another negative number, in this case it's a whole negative number, 2, times a negative fraction, 1/3, we get a positive answer. And it doesn't matter what the quality of the number is. It could be -2 times -1. It would still be positive 2. So in order to remain consistent in what we're doing, we're forced into realizing that the product of two negative numbers has got to be a positive number. Now, if you want a more sort of visual way of thinking about it, I don't know how many of you have learned anything about imaginary numbers, but you might remember that if you draw an x and y coordinate system, and you're talking about imaginary numbers, the x-axis would be the real numbers, and the y-axis would be the imaginary numbers. And we had this thing called I, which is defined as the square root of -1. So what happens if you begin with the square root of -1 on the y-axis and you multiply by the square root of -1? Well, you get a -1. So you go from the y-axis, square root of -1, down to the real number line where it's -1. And if you multiply by the square root of -1 again, times -1, you get negative the square root of -1. And if you do that again, in other words, multiply by the square root of -1 yet again, you're back to the number 1. minus 1 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 gives you a positive 1. You can see each time you apply, meaning multiply by the square root of negative 1, you get a 90-degree rotation around that plane. Well, you could think of multiplying by a negative 1, not a square root of negative 1, but a negative 1 as a 180-degree rotation around the real plane. If you start out with 1, multiply by negative 1, you get to negative 1 on the other side of the line. If you multiply now by negative 1 again, negative 1 times negative 1, you're back to positive 1. So you're looping around 180 degrees each time you multiply by negative 1. Just a little visual way of trying to grasp what's going on as well. It's all very internally consistent, no matter how you think about it. The product of two negative numbers has to be positive. So we're going to end the video here, and we're going to put up the discussion that I had at the beginning with -2 over -3 and showing you ended up with a positive 2/3 when you do the multiplication. If you like, you can pause the video as soon as you see the explanation, and you'll be able to spend as much time as you need looking it over or do a screenshot. All right, thanks a lot. Have a good one.